In the last lecture, you learned that the attributes that we set here are passed to our component using a single JavaScript object called props. Now we have a special prop called children, and we use that when we want to pass something between the opening and closing tag of an element. So here, counter is self-closed, but sometimes we want to pass content in between the opening and closing tags. Maybe we want to pass an h4 here with some kind of title, like this. A real-world example of this is when using dialog boxes. Imagine instead of the counter component, you have a dialog box component, and you want to allow the consumer of that component to pass content to be rendered on the dialog box. So let me show you how to do this. Save the changes. Now, back in our counter component, one more time in the render method, I'm going to show you the props property. So console.log of this.props. Now, back in the browser. So here's our props object. You can see we have the value property just like before, but we have a new property called children. Let's take a closer look. So children is essentially a React element. As we can see here, the type of this React element is h4. So back in our counter component, here in the render method, we can simply render the children prop. So here inside this div, right before our span, I'm going to render this.props.children. As simple as that. Save the changes. Now you can see each counter has a title. We can also make this dynamic. So here in counters component, instead of hard coding this title, we can do something like this: counter number, and then render counter.id dynamically. And here's the result. Now in this particular example, we didn't really have to use the children. We could simply pass the ID as another attribute. We could set that here, counter.id. And in our counter component, we could simply render an h4 that includes this.props.id. We would get the same result. But as I told you earlier, there are times that you want to pass complex elements to a child component, such as a dialog box. In those cases, you use the children prop. Now going forward, we're not going to use the children props, so I'm going to delete the code that I wrote in this lecture. So back in our counters component, let's delete the children.